December 20th, 1943. 27,300 feet above Bremen, Germany. The gloved hand of Second Lieutenant Charles Brown trembled against the control column as he watched engine number 2 spew black smoke across the frozen German sky. The temperature outside read -40 degrees Celsius. Inside his oxygen mask, Brown's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to keep the crippled B-17 flying fortress level. Through the shattered plexiglass nose, wind screamed into the cockpit at 135 miles per hour. What 21-year-old Charlie Brown didn't know was that in the next 30 minutes, his encounter with a German fighter ace would demonstrate something impossible according to all military doctrine of 1943, that enemies could choose humanity over duty. That honor could transcend nationality. That a single decision made in the freezing sky above Germany would prove more powerful than any weapon carried by either side. The story that would unfold over the next hour would remain classified for decades, buried by authorities on both sides who understood that such an incident threatened to complicate the simple narrative of good versus evil that wars require. But the truth, when it finally emerged 47 years later, would reveal one of the most profound acts of mercy in military history. Brown had woken that morning at RAF Kimballton in England, a farm boy from Western West Virginia, about to fly his first mission as aircraft commander. At 21 years old, he had been entrusted with the lives of 9 other young men and a 4-engine bomber worth $240,000. Most of his crew were barely out of their teens, yet each man was a specialist trained for months in his particular role. Together they flew a bomber they had named Ye Old Pub, painted on the nose along with the image of a frothy beer mug. The mission briefing had been clear and not terrifying. Nearly 500 B-17s from the 8th Air Force would strike the Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft factory in Bremen, deep in northern Germany. This factory produced some of the Luftwaffe's most lethal fighters, and German High Command would defend it to the death. Intelligence reported the target was defended by 250 flak guns, arranged in concentric rings around the city. Hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters from multiple Jägerschwaders were expected to intercept. The briefing officer had been blunt. Expect heavy resistance. Expect casualties. Some of you won't be coming back. Brown's crew had been assigned to Purple Heart Corner, the most dangerous position in the formation. This was the outer edge of the bomber stream, the vulnerable flank where German fighters concentrated their attacks. Isolated bombers in this position rarely survived concentrated fighter assault. The crews knew what the assignment meant. The veterans called it the coffin corner. The new crews just looked at each other with pale faces and said nothing. The weather over the North Sea had been brutal. Ice formed on the wings and windscreens. Temperatures plunged as they climbed to bombing altitude. 3 bombers had already turned back with mechanical problems before they even reached Germany, forcing the formation to compress and Brown's aircraft to move forward into an even more exposed position. The mission had started to unravel during the bomb run. As Ye Old Pub began its 10-minute approach, anti-aircraft fire erupted around them like deadly black flowers with crimson centers. The first shell exploded directly in front of the aircraft, shredding the plexiglass nose and sending shrapnel through the forward compartment. The concussion knocked out engine number 2 completely and damaged engine number 4, which began to overspeed dangerously. Brown fought the controls as the bomber slowed, unable to maintain formation speed. The other B-17s pulled ahead, their contrails fading into the distance. Ye Old Pub fell back, alone, a wounded bird separated from the flock. That was when the sharks arrived. At least 12 Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s of Jägerschwader 11 swarmed the crippled bomber. For more than 10 minutes they attacked in waves. Brown did the only thing he could. He turned into each attack using his remaining forward guns to disrupt their aim. The defensive maneuver worked just enough to keep them alive, but the damage mounted with terrifying speed. Engine number 3 took hits that reduced it to half power. The bomber now had effectively 40% of its total rated power available. The oxygen system ruptured, and both Brown and his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke, lost consciousness. Without oxygen at 27,000 feet, they had minutes to live. The bomber began to fall. Ye Old Pub dropped through the sky, spiraling toward the frozen German countryside below. At 3,000 feet, barely above the rooftops of Oldenburg, Brown regained consciousness. His training took over. He pulled back on the controls with every ounce of strength, and somehow, impossibly, the bomber leveled out. They were so low that Brown could see the expressions of shock on the faces of German civilians below, watching an American bomber pass close enough to shear tiles off their roofs. Brown took inventory of the damage and felt his stomach drop. The hydraulic system was destroyed, meaning no flaps, no brakes, manual landing gear deployment only. The electrical system barely functioned. Half the rudder was gone, shot completely away. The entire tail section was shredded, looking like Swiss cheese. The horizontal stabilizer had been hit so many times it was amazing it still provided any control authority. 10 of the bomber's 11 defensive guns were frozen solid or destroyed completely. Only the top turret guns and one nose gun still worked, leaving them nearly defenseless. The nose section had been blown completely open. The plexiglass bombardier compartment had shattered, creating a howling wind tunnel that made communication almost impossible and threatened to tear apart anything not secured. Shell fragments had punctured fuel tanks. Hydraulic fluid streamed from severed lines, freezing into crystals in the -40-degree air. Control cables had been cut and were held together by just a few strands. In the rear of the aircraft, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, lay dead at his position, killed instantly by a 20mm cannon shell. Several other crew members were severely wounded, including waist gunner Alex Yelisanko, who had taken shrapnel to his leg and shoulder. The ball turret gunner, Sam Blackford, was unconscious from oxygen deprivation and had to be pulled from his position. The entire crew was suffering from frostbite, their fingers and faces turning white in the sub-zero temperatures. Oxygen deprivation had left several men confused and disoriented. Brown's own shoulder burned where a metal fragment had torn through his flight jacket. He could feel blood soaking his shirt, but there was nothing to be done about it now. His co-pilot, Spencer Luke, was in similar condition, wounded but functional. They had to keep flying. Brown offered his crew the chance to bail out. Becoming prisoners of war was better than dying in a doomed aircraft. To a man, they refused. They would fly home together or die together. The crippled bomber limped north at 135 miles per hour, leaving a trail of smoke and hydraulic fluid. They had to cross 250 miles of North Sea to reach England. Brown knew their chances were essentially zero. But they flew on. What Brown didn't know was that their flight path had taken them directly over a Luftwaffe airfield near the town of Jever. And on that airfield, refueling and rearming his Messerschmitt 109, was a 28-year-old fighter pilot who was about to make the most important decision of his life. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler had been born August 21st, 1915 in Regensburg, Bavaria, into a family with deep aviation roots. His father had been a pilot in the First World War, flying reconnaissance missions over the Western Front. Franz had absorbed aviation like oxygen from his earliest childhood. By age 12, he was already flying gliders in the hills around Regensburg, learning to read the wind and sky with an instinct that would later save his life many times. By 1933, when he was just 18 years old, he was piloting powered biplanes. His natural talent was obvious. Before the war, he had been selected to fly for Deutsche Lufthansa, the predecessor of modern Lufthansa, as a commercial airline pilot. This was an elite position, available only to the most skilled aviators. He flew passenger routes across Europe, accumulating thousands of hours of flight time and developing the smooth, precise control that would characterize his combat flying. When war came in 1939, Stigler faced a choice. He could remain in commercial aviation, exempt from military service as an essential transport pilot, or he could join the Luftwaffe. He chose to serve. When Stigler joined the Luftwaffe in 1940, his experience meant he became an instructor pilot first, teaching new recruits the basics of military aviation. One of his students was a young pilot named Gerhard Barkhorn, who would go on to shoot down more than 300 aircraft, becoming one of the highest-scoring aces in history. But Stigler wanted combat duty. Instructing was important, but he felt he could contribute more at the front. He requested transfer to a fighter squadron. In 1942, he got his wish. He was assigned to Jagerschwader 27 and sent to North Africa, where Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was fighting the British 8th Army across the deserts of Libya and Tunisia. In the deserts of Libya and Tunisia, under the command of the legendary Eduard Neumann, Stigler learned his craft under the most demanding conditions imaginable. He flew alongside some of Germany's greatest aces. The desert was an unforgiving teacher. Engine failures meant death in the sand. Navigation errors meant disappearing forever. But it was also a place where a certain kind of chivalry still existed. British and German pilots who shot each other down in the morning sometimes shared drinks in the evening after being captured. There were rules, unwritten but understood. One experience in North Africa would shape everything that followed. His squadron commander, Gustav Rodel, who had served with distinction since the Battle of Britain, gathered his pilots one day for what seemed like a routine briefing. But Rodel's words were anything but routine. "You are fighter pilots first, last, always," Rodel had said, his voice hard, as iron. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." The message was clear. There were limits even in war. There were lines that honourable men did not cross. A pilot descending in a parachute was defenceless, helpless. To kill such a man was murder, not combat. Stigler never forgot those words. By December 1943, Stigler had returned to Germany after the collapse of the Afrika Korps. He had 27 confirmed victories to his name and was approaching the threshold for earning the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honours. For a fighter pilot, the medal meant everything: recognition, honour, proof that you had done your duty. It meant you had survived when so many others had died. That morning of December 20th, Stigler had already shot down 2 B-17s. One more bomber and he would be closer to his Knight's Cross. Stigler was on the ground when he heard the distinctive sound of American engines struggling overhead. His Messerschmitt 109 was being refueled and rearmed. The aircraft already had a .50 caliber bullet lodged in its radiator from the morning's combat, risking engine overheating. But when Stigler saw the crippled B-17 passing low overhead, trailing smoke, he made an instant decision. He scrambled into his fighter and took off. Stigler caught up with Ye Old Pub in less than 2 minutes. He positioned himself to the bomber's rear, the classic attack position. His finger moved toward the gun button. This was it. The easy kill. Another step toward the Knight's Cross. Everything he had fought for. Then he saw what was inside the bomber. Through the massive holes torn in the fuselage by cannon fire, Stigler could see everything. He could see the dead tail gunner slumped over his guns. He could see crew members covered in blood, desperately trying to help their wounded comrades. He could see the pilot, hunched over the controls, fighting to keep the shattered aircraft in the air. The bomber's tail section was almost completely destroyed. The nose cone was missing. The aircraft had so many holes that Stigler could see clear through from one side to the other. It was a miracle the plane was still flying at all. Stigler moved closer, flying alongside the bomber's right wing, close enough to see individual rivets and the ragged edges of torn metal. He could see the pilot's face now through the shattered cockpit window. A young man, younger than Stigler himself, with fear and determination written across his features. The pilot's hands gripped the control column with white-knuckled intensity. Blood stained his flight jacket. For a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Stigler's finger hovered over the firing button. One squeeze and it would be over in seconds. The bomber would fall from the sky, 9 Americans would die, but they were already dead men anyway. This wreck couldn't possibly make it across the North Sea. He would be doing them a mercy, ending it quickly rather than letting them drown in freezing water or burn when fuel tanks exploded. Another victory would be his. Another step toward the recognition he had earned through 2 years of combat. Then Gustav Rodel's words echoed in his mind, as clear as if his commander was sitting in the cockpit beside him. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." Stigler looked at the dying bomber and its wounded crew and understood something that changed everything. They weren't in a parachute, but they might as well have been. They were defenseless, helpless. They posed no threat to Germany, to his comrades, to anyone. Most of their guns were destroyed, frozen solid in the sub-zero air. The few guns that remained operational were manned by wounded, exhausted men who could barely stay conscious. They were just trying to survive, trying to get home, trying to save their friends. This wasn't combat anymore. This was something else entirely. To me, it was just like they were in a parachute, Stigler would later explain. I saw them, and I couldn't shoot them down. It would have been murder, not war. In that moment, Franz Stigler made his choice. He chose honor over glory, humanity over duty, life over death, conscience over orders. But Stigler didn't just refuse to shoot. In a decision that defied all military logic and put his own life at immense risk, he did something far more extraordinary. He decided to save them. Brown and his co-pilot Spencer Luke watched in confusion and rising terror as the German fighter moved into formation on their right wing, just feet away from their wingtip. This was it, they thought. The end. The fighter would finish them off at point-blank range where even a child couldn't miss. They would never see it coming. The cannon shells would tear through the fuselage, and that would be that. No parachutes, no survival, just an instant fireball and a long fall into the German countryside below. But the German pilot didn't fire. Instead, he gestured frantically, waving his hand and pointing downward, then to the side. Stigler was trying to communicate something, but in the chaos and noise of wind screaming through the shattered nose, with engines coughing and sputtering, with half the crew barely conscious from wounds and oxygen deprivation, Brown couldn't understand. The German pilot seemed to be indicating they should land, right here, right now, surrender on German soil. Brown shook his head vigorously. There was no way he was surrendering his crew to become prisoners. They would fly until the wings fell off. They would ditch in the ocean if they had to, but they wouldn't give up. Stigler tried again, this time pointing more deliberately toward the east, toward Sweden and neutral territory. His meaning was clearer now. Neutral Sweden was closer than England, maybe 150 miles versus 250. If the Americans diverted there right now, they would be interned for the duration of the war, but they would live. They would receive medical treatment. The wounded would be saved. They would sit out the war in safety and return home when it was over. It was their best chance, possibly their only chance. Brown still didn't understand, or perhaps he understood but refused to accept. He kept the bomber pointed north, toward England, toward home, toward the bases and friends and the country he had sworn to serve. They would make it home or die trying. Stigler realized the Americans didn't comprehend his gestures or had chosen to ignore them, and he understood something else that filled him with dread. This bomber, crawling through the sky at 135 miles per hour, at barely 1,000 feet altitude, was about to cross the Atlantic Wall. This was Germany's fortified coastline, where thousands of anti-aircraft guns were positioned in overlapping fields of fire specifically to destroy low-flying aircraft exactly like this one. The gunners along the coast were some of the best in the German military, men who had been shooting at Allied aircraft for years. They could hit a target this slow and this low with their eyes closed. In its current condition, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, flying straight and level because it couldn't do anything else, Ye Old Pub wouldn't survive 30 seconds once those guns opened up. The bomber would be torn to pieces before it reached the water. So Stigler made another decision that defied all military logic and made what he had already done seem almost reasonable by comparison. He moved his fighter into tight formation on the bomber's left wing, so close that Brown could see every detail of the German pilot's face through the canopy, so close that their wingtips were separated by mere feet, close enough that any turbulence, any slight miscalculation, Any moment of inattention would cause a crisis, catastrophic collision that would kill everyone. Stigler looked across the space between them and made eye contact with Brown. For several seconds, the two pilots stared at each other. Then Stigler did something that changed everything. He saluted. It was a formal military salute, the kind rendered between officers of equal rank. A salute of respect, of recognition, of one warrior acknowledging another, a salute that said, "I see you. I know what you're doing. I know you're trying to save your men. I honor that." And then Stigler did something even more remarkable. He stayed in formation, holding position on the bomber's left wing with the precision of an airshow demonstration pilot. German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground were trained to shoot at any aircraft that came within range, to fire first and identify later. The standing orders were clear. If it flies, if it's low, if it's over Germany, shoot it down. No exceptions, no hesitation. Thousands of Allied aircraft had been destroyed by these guns. The gunners were veterans, experienced, deadly accurate. But the gunners were also trained to recognize their own aircraft. They knew the distinctive silhouette of a Messerschmitt 109. They knew what German formations looked like. They knew their own squadron markings and call signs. When they looked up and saw a Messerschmitt 109 flying in tight formation with a bomber, flying so close that the two aircraft looked almost connected, their training told them something different than their standing orders. This must be a captured Allied aircraft being escorted to a German airfield, or perhaps a German bomber returning from a test flight, or some kind of special operation that they hadn't been briefed about. Whatever it was, the presence of the German fighter meant don't shoot. Stigler used his own aircraft as a human shield. He risked his life, risked being shot down by his own anti-aircraft guns if they recognized the bomber as American, to protect an enemy aircraft. He risked court-martial and execution if anyone reported what he was doing. He risked collision with the bomber, whose pilot might make a sudden maneuver at any second. He risked running out of fuel over the North Sea with no way to return home. For over 15 minutes, as long as it took for a bomber at 135 miles per hour to cross the coastal defences, he flew alongside Ye Old Pub. Formation flying this close required total concentration. Any distraction, any loss of focus, any moment of inattention meant death for everyone. He held position through turbulence, through the bomber's erratic movements as its damaged controls responded unpredictably, through the temptation to look down at the German gunners below, who must be watching this bizarre formation pass overhead. They flew over Wilhelmshaven, over the submarine pens and naval facilities. They flew over gun positions that could have destroyed them both in seconds. They flew over German towns where people looked up and saw an American bomber escorted by a German fighter and wondered what was happening in the sky above them. All the way across the German coastline, over the deadly Atlantic wall, until they reached open water and safety. Brown still didn't fully understand what was happening. The German fighter stayed glued to their wing. Was he herding them somewhere? Was this some kind of trap? Brown ordered his dorsal turret gunner to train the guns on the German fighter, but not to fire, just to warn him off. Stigler saw the guns tracking him. He understood the message. The Americans still didn't trust him. But that was okay. They were over water now. They were safe from German guns. They had a chance. Stigler pulled away from the bomber. He looked across at Brown one more time. Then he raised his hand in a final salute, rolled his fighter, and turned back toward Germany. Brown watched the German fighter disappear into the clouds, dwindling to a speck, and then vanishing entirely. His mind reeled, trying to process what had just happened. A German fighter pilot, an enemy combatant whose job was to kill Americans, had just saved their lives. Not just refrained from shooting, but actively escorted them to safety, putting his own life at risk to do it. It made no sense according to anything they had been taught. Every briefing, every propaganda poster, every training film had painted the enemy as fanatics who showed no mercy. Yet this German pilot had shown nothing but mercy. It contradicted everything. But there was no time to wonder about miracles or try to understand the incomprehensible. They still had 250 miles of storm-tossed North Sea to cross, and the odds of making it were still almost zero. With 3 engines damaged or destroyed, with the entire aircraft held together by prayers and a few surviving control cables, Ye Old Pub barely maintained altitude. The bomber was slowly, inexorably, losing height. The crew worked frantically to keep them alive. They threw out everything that wasn't bolted down to reduce weight. Ammunition boxes went first, then the ammunition itself, thousands of rounds of 50 caliber bullets tumbling into the sea. The machine guns followed, torn from their mounts and heaved through the shattered nose and waist windows. Equipment, tools, personal belongings, anything that added weight. They stripped the aircraft down to an empty shell. The navigator plotted and replotted their course, trying to find the shortest route home while accounting for wind drift with almost no instruments. The radio operator tried desperately to raise anyone on the radio, but the electrical system was so damaged that he couldn't transmit, only receive occasional bursts of static. They were alone in the sky, unheard, unknown, fighting for every mile. For 4 hours that felt like 4 days, Brown fought the controls. His wounded shoulder throbbed with every movement, the pain growing, worse as adrenaline wore off and cold set in. His fingers were numb with cold, despite his flight gloves. His face was frostbitten, the skin white and waxy. His mind was foggy from oxygen deprivation and exhaustion. But he kept the bomber flying through sheer force of will, making constant tiny corrections to keep the wings level, the nose up, the engines running. The North Sea in December was among the most hostile environments on Earth. Storms swept across the grey water constantly. Visibility dropped to near zero in squalls. The water temperature was cold enough to kill a man in minutes. If they had to ditch, if the engines finally quit or the wings finally broke off, they would hit the water and have perhaps 2 minutes before hypothermia made rescue impossible, and there would be no rescue. No one knew where they were. No one was looking for them. They had been written off hours ago. But somehow, impossibly, the battered bomber kept flying. Engine number 1. The only engine, operating at full power, continued to turn. Engine number 3, damaged but functional, provided enough thrust to help. Even engine number 4, overheating and vibrating dangerously, kept running when by all rights it should have exploded. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the English coast appeared through the clouds. Brown had no idea where they were. The radio was dead. Navigation equipment destroyed. The compass was unreliable due to all the metal damage. He just looked for any airfield, any flat piece of ground long enough to accommodate a dying bomber. Then he saw it. RAF Seething, home of the 448th Bomb Group. The runway stretched out below them, a blessed strip of concrete that meant salvation. Brown lined up for final approach, but nothing was simple. The hydraulics were gone, which meant the landing gear had to be cranked down manually. 2 crew members struggled with the manual hand crank, turning it hundreds of times to lower the massive wheels. The flaps, which normally extended to slow the aircraft for landing, wouldn't extend at all. They were coming in fast, too fast, and there was nothing Brown could do about it. No flaps meant they would hit the runway at nearly 140 miles per hour instead of the normal 90. No hydraulic brakes meant once they touched down, they would have only mechanical brakes to stop them, if those even worked. The crosswind pushed them sideways. Brown compensated, but his control inputs were mushy, delayed, because half the control cables had been shot away. The bomber dropped toward the runway. Brown fought to keep the wings level. The ground rushed up. At the last second, he pulled back on the control column, trying to flare, to slow the descent. The bomber hit the runway hard, harder than any landing Brown had ever made. The entire aircraft shuddered. Something broke in the undercarriage with an ominous cracking sound. They bounced, rose 20 feet back into the air, seemed to hang there for a moment, then hit again. This time the wheels stayed down. They were rolling, slewing sideways, but rolling. Brown stood on the mechanical brakes. The bomber slowed, but not fast enough. The end of the runway appeared ahead. They were going to overshoot. There was nothing to be done. They rolled off the end of the runway onto the grass, bouncing and shaking, finally sliding to a stop in a muddy field. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Brown reached up and cut all the engine switches. The sudden silence was overwhelming. After hours of engine roar and wind scream, the quiet felt unnatural. The crew sat in stunned silence for a long moment, unable to believe they were alive, unable to believe they were home, unable to process that they had just survived what should have been impossible. When the crew finally climbed out of Ye Old Pub, using the holes in the fuselage as handholds because the normal hatches were jammed or destroyed, ground personnel stared in disbelief. Maintenance officers and flight crews came running from all directions, drawn by the spectacle of what appeared to be a flying wreck somehow still in one piece. The bomber looked like it had been through a shredder and then reassembled wrong. Maintenance officers walked around it in silence, counting holes, examining damage, shaking their heads. They counted more than 400 holes in the fuselage. Some holes were small, from machine gun bullets. Others were massive, from 20mm and 30mm cannon shells. You could look through the aircraft from one side and see daylight on the other. The tail section was barely attached to the rest of the aircraft, held on by a few structural members that should have failed under any flight loads. The nose was completely gone, just a ragged opening where plexiglass and metal had been. 3 of the 4 engines were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The wings looked like lace, so many holes that it seemed impossible they still provided lift. One maintenance officer, a veteran who had seen hundreds of damaged bombers, remarked that he had never seen a bomber so badly damaged still capable of flight. Another said it was a miracle anyone survived, that by all the laws of aerodynamics and probability, this aircraft should have fallen out of the sky over Germany. A third simply said that God himself must have been the co-pilot, because no human pilot could have brought this wreck home. At the debriefing, held in a cold office with intelligence officers who had heard every kind of combat story imaginable, Brown told his commanding officers everything. He described the flak damage, the fighter attacks, the spiral toward the ground, the recovery at 3,000 feet. He described the damage to the aircraft, the casualties, the desperate flight north. And then he described something that made the intelligence officers stop writing and look up with expressions of disbelief. He described the German fighter pilot who had escorted them to safety. He described how the enemy pilot had positioned his aircraft to shield them from anti-aircraft fire. He described the salute. He described how this German pilot had risked his own life, violated his orders, and committed what could be considered treason under Nazi military law, all to save 10 American airmen he had never met. The officers listened in complete silence. When Brown finished, nobody spoke for a long moment. Then the ranking intelligence officer closed his notebook and made a decision that would seal this story away for nearly 5 decades. The incident was classified secret. No one, absolutely no one, was to speak of it. Ever. Not to other crews, not to family, not to friends, not to anyone. The classification would remain in effect indefinitely. Any violation would result in court-martial. The reasoning was clear and coldly logical. The story of a chivalrous German pilot might encourage Allied air crews to let their guard down, to hesitate in combat, to look for mercy where none existed. It might create sympathy for the enemy at a time when the war effort required absolute demonization of the opponent. In total war, there was no room for such complications. The narrative had to remain simple. Us versus them. Good versus evil. Democracy versus fascism. There could be no shades of grey, no enemy with a conscience, no German capable of mercy. The official line was stated bluntly. You can't be human and be flying in a German cockpit. They're all Nazis, all fanatics, all killers. What you experienced was an aberration, possibly an attempted deception. Don't speak of it. Don't think about it. Don't let it change how you fight this war. Brown was ordered to sign a document acknowledging the classification. He complied. He understood the reasoning, even if he disagreed with it. He had seen what he had seen. He knew what he knew, but he would keep silent. He completed his combat tour, flying more missions, losing more friends, watching more bombers fall from the sky. He went home to West Virginia when the war ended, tried to reintegrate into civilian life, found it difficult. He attended college on the GI Bill, earning a degree. He returned to the newly formed United States Air Force in 1949, unable to fully leave military service behind. He served in the Office of Special Investigations, hunting Nazi war criminals, ironically enough. He served with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, working on strategic planning. He served in various other assignments across 2 decades until his retirement in 1972 with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. But through all those years, through all those assignments, through marriage and children and the ordinary passages of civilian life, he never forgot the German pilot who had saved his life. The memory haunted him. He saw that Messerschmitt 109 in his dreams. He saw the salute. He wondered, constantly, whether the German pilot had survived the war, whether he was still alive, whether he ever thought about that December day. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Franz Stigler landed his fighter at his base near Bremen and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He said nothing about what he had done. Not to his squadron mates, who would have called him a traitor, not to his commanding officers, who would have court-martialed him, not to his family, who would have been endangered by the knowledge. Not to anyone, ever. The reason was brutally simple. Under Nazi military law, as interpreted by increasingly paranoid and vicious authorities in late 1943, what Stigler had done was a capital offence. He had allowed an enemy aircraft to escape when he had the clear opportunity to destroy it. He had actively aided the enemy by escorting them to safety. He had placed his own aircraft at risk to protect enemy personnel. Any of these actions alone could be interpreted as treason, cowardice, or defeatism. Together, they constituted an ironclad case for execution. The Nazi regime had become increasingly brutal in its treatment of perceived traitors. Officers were shot for far less than what Stigler had done. Pilots who turned back from missions due to mechanical problems were sometimes accused of cowardice. Men who expressed doubts about ultimate victory were arrested by the Gestapo. In this atmosphere of paranoia and terror, Stigler's act of mercy would have been seen as ultimate betrayal. If anyone had learned what Stigler did that day, he would have been arrested within hours. The Gestapo would have investigated. They would have questioned his family, his friends, his squadron mates. They would have looked for other signs of defeatism or disloyalty. The investigation alone would have destroyed him and everyone he knew, even if he somehow avoided execution. So Stigler remained silent. He buried the memory deep. He never claimed the bomber as a kill, which would have been easy enough to do since no one had witnessed the encounter. He never spoke of the incident, not even in his personal diary. He sealed it away and continued fighting, day after day, mission after mission, pretending it had never happened. But something had changed in Franz Stigler that December day. He continued to fly combat missions. He continued to engage Allied aircraft. He continued to do his duty as a fighter pilot. But he never again felt the same enthusiasm for accumulating victories. The Knight's Cross, which had seemed so important that morning, suddenly mattered less. He flew to protect his comrades, to defend his homeland, to do his duty. But the glory was gone, replaced by a weariness and a growing understanding that this war would not end well for Germany. Stigler went on to fly 487 combat missions, an almost incomprehensible number that represented nearly 3 years of continuous combat flying. He was shot down 17 times, a testament both to his skill at survival and to the increasing ferocity of Allied air power. He bailed out 6 times, each time landing behind German lines and returning to duty. He crash-landed 11 times, walking away from wrecks that should have killed him. He finished the war flying the revolutionary Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, one of the first operational jet aircraft in history, with Jagdverband 44. This was an elite unit commanded by Adolf Galland, one of Germany's greatest aces. Flying jets against piston-engine aircraft should have been easy, but by then the Allies had such overwhelming numbers that even technological superiority couldn't change the outcome. Stigler flew missions until the final days of the war, landing his jet on cratered autobahns as German airfields were overrun, fighting an increasingly hopeless battle. He survived the war with 27 confirmed victories, though the actual number was certainly higher. Many of his combats went unwitnessed, many victories unclaimed. After his encounter with Ye Old Pub, he had lost his appetite for claiming kills. He just flew, fought, survived another day, and tried not to think about what would happen when Germany finally lost. When the war ended in May 1945, Stigler found himself in a destroyed Germany that bore no resemblance to the country he had fought to defend. His brother, August, also a pilot, had been killed in October 1940 when his Junkers 88 crashed during a night operation over France. August had been 24 years old, flying bombing missions over Britain when he died. Franz was now the last male in his immediate family, the only one who had survived the war that had consumed so many millions. The country Stigler had fought for lay in ruins, both literally and morally. The cities were bombed flat, the economy had collapsed, food was scarce, but worse than the physical destruction was the moral catastrophe. The concentration camps had been liberated. The full horror of the Holocaust was being revealed. The regime that Stigler had served, however reluctantly in the final years, stood exposed as one of history's greatest evils. Like many German veterans, Stigler had to reconcile his service with the terrible truth of what his country had done. He had fought for Germany, for his homeland, for his comrades. He had never joined the Nazi Party. He had never participated in war crimes. But he had served the regime, had helped defend it, had shot down Allied pilots who were fighting to destroy that evil. The moral complexity was crushing. In 1953, unable to build a future in a divided and devastated Germany, Stigler made the difficult decision to emigrate. He chose Canada, settling in Vancouver, British Columbia. He started a business from nothing, working 18-hour days to establish himself in a new country. He married, raised a family, learned English, became a Canadian citizen. He tried to put the war behind him, to build a new life, to forget the past. But one memory stayed with him always, vivid and inescapable. The memory of a December day in 1943 when he had made a choice that defined who he was. The memory of a crippled bomber and wounded men trying to survive. The memory of a young American pilot fighting to save his crew. The memory of a decision to choose mercy over duty, humanity over orders, conscience over career. Stigler never spoke of it, not even to his wife, not for decades. The secret sat inside him like a stone. He wondered constantly what had happened to that bomber crew. Had they made it home? Had they survived the war? Did they remember him? Did they understand what he had risked? Or did they think it had been some kind of trick, some German deception? The two pilots lived parallel lives for decades, never knowing if the other had survived the war. Brown built his life in Miami, Florida, working in energy and environmental research, raising a family, trying to forget the war but never quite succeeding. Stigler built his life in Vancouver, running his business, raising his family, trying to forget the war but carrying always that one memory that refused to fade. They lived on opposite sides of the continent, separated by thousands of miles and decades of silence, completely unaware of each other's existence. Brown didn't know if the German pilot had survived the war, had been shot down, had been executed for what he did, or had simply disappeared into the chaos of defeated Germany. Stigler didn't know if the bomber had made it across the North Sea, if the crew had lived or died, if his mercy had mattered or been wasted on men who died minutes after he left them. They were connected by an invisible thread, two men bound together by 30 minutes in December 1943, but separated by circumstance, by geography, by the classification stamp on a military file, by the silence that both had maintained for different reasons. Then, in 1986, everything changed. Brown was invited to speak at the Gathering of the Eagles, a reunion of combat pilots at the Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. This was a gathering of veterans, Men who had flown in every theatre of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Men who had seen everything combat aviation could throw at them. During a question and answer session after his formal remarks, someone asked if he had any particularly memorable missions from World War II. Brown hesitated. He had been ordered never to speak of the incident. The classification was still technically in effect, even 43 years later, but he was retired now, a civilian. The war was ancient history. Most of the people who had classified the story were long dead. The Soviet Union was collapsing, the Cold War ending. What harm could it do now to tell the truth? And more than that, Brown was old enough now to understand that some stories needed to be told, that history belonged to more than just governments and generals, that there were truths which mattered more than classification stamps and military orders. So for the first time in 43 years, Brown broke his silence. He told the story of the German fighter pilot who had saved his life. He described the encounter in detail, the salute, the escort, the mercy shown to enemies, the choice to save rather than kill. The audience of hardened combat veterans sat in stunned silence. These were men who had flown through flak and fighters, who had lost friends, who had killed enemies, who understood the brutal mathematics of aerial warfare. Some openly wept as Brown spoke. Others sat stone-faced, processing what they were hearing. A few seemed skeptical, wondering if age and trauma had distorted Brown's memories. Could such a thing really have happened? In the midst of total war, when the survival of civilization itself seemed to hang in the balance, could an enemy pilot have chosen mercy? Could a German fighter pilot, serving perhaps the most evil regime in human history, have possessed such humanity? After the speech, something fundamental changed in Charlie Brown. He realized he needed to know. After 43 years of silence, after 43 years of wondering, he needed to find out if the German pilot had survived. He needed to thank the man who had given him 43 more years of life, who had allowed him to come home, to marry, to have children, to build a life. He needed to close this circle, to find an answer to the question that had haunted his dreams for nearly half a century. Brown began a search that would consume the next 4 years of his life. He wrote letters to the United States Air Force Historical Office, requesting any records from the mission of December 20th, 1943. He contacted the German Federal Archives, asking for Luftwaffe personnel files. He reached out to the West German Air Force, hoping they might have records of pilots stationed near Bremen. He wrote to veteran organizations in both countries, hoping someone might remember something, might know something. He searched through mission reports, trying to match timelines. He studied German fighter unit dispositions, trying to narrow down which squadrons had been active in that area on that date. He looked at aerial photographs of German airfields, trying to identify which ones had been close enough for a fighter to intercept his bomber. He cross-referenced everything, building a database of information that should have pointed him toward an answer, but he found nothing. Records from December 1943 were sparse, scattered, often destroyed. The Allied bombing campaign had destroyed many German archives. The chaos at the end of the war had led to more losses. What survived was often incomplete or inconsistent. German fighter pilot names remained classified in some cases, lost in others. Nobody seemed to remember anything about a fighter escorting a bomber to safety. Brown began to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing. His memories of that day were hazy in places, clouded by injury, oxygen deprivation, shock, and exhaustion. Maybe the German pilot hadn't really saluted. Maybe there had been no escort. Maybe the fighter had just happened to fly alongside them by coincidence, heading back to base. Maybe his traumatized mind had created a story of mercy to cope with the horror of watching Eckenrode die, of nearly dying himself, of bringing home a bomber full of wounded men. But he knew what he had seen. He knew what had happened. The memory was too vivid, too detailed, too specific to be a hallucination or a delusion. The salute had happened. The escort had happened. The mercy had been real. But Brown refused to give up. He had flown a shattered bomber across 250 miles of ocean. He could pursue this, search, until he found an answer, or proved conclusively that no answer existed. In 1990, after 4 years of dead ends and disappointments, Brown decided to try one last approach. He wrote a letter to combat crew, a newsletter circulated among former Luftwaffe pilots. The letter was simple and direct. He described the mission, the date, the location. He described his B-17, the damage it had sustained, how it had been shot to pieces but somehow still flying. He described the fighter escort, the salute, the mercy. He asked a simple question. "Do you remember this? Were you the pilot? Does anyone know who this pilot was?" He sent the letter, fully expecting nothing to come of it. He had sent so many letters over 4 years. Everyone had led nowhere. Why should this be any different? He sent the letter and waited, trying not to hope too much, trying to prepare himself for another disappointment. 4 months later, an envelope arrived from Vancouver, Canada. Brown's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a letter in careful handwriting. "I was the one," it said. The letter was from Franz Stigler. Brown called the number on the letter. When Stigler answered, Brown asked him to describe what he remembered. Stigler described the bomber, the damage, the escort. He described flying formation on the left wing. He described his black Messerschmitt 109. He described saluting before he broke away. Every detail matched Brown's memory perfectly. Both men began to cry on the phone. They had found each other. After 47 years, the two warriors were reunited. They agreed to meet in person. On June 21, 1990, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler stood face to face for the first time since that December day in 1943. They embraced like brothers. For Brown, it was like a weight lifted from his shoulders. The nightmares that had plagued him for decades began to fade. He finally had answers to questions that had haunted him for nearly half a century. For Stigler, it was vindication. His choice to spare the bomber had been right. These men had gone on to live full lives, to raise families, to contribute to society. He had made the right decision, even though it had cost him advancement toward the Knight's Cross, even though it could have cost him his life. The two men became inseparable friends. They visited each other frequently, traveling between Vancouver and Miami. They appeared together at air shows, veteran reunions, and history conferences, telling their story to anyone who would listen. In 1993, Stigler was presented with the Star of Peace Award by the Combatants Federation of Europe, recognizing his act of mercy 50 years earlier. In 2008, following a request from Charlie Brown, all crew members of Ye Old Pub who had survived were awarded the Silver Star for their valor during the mission. Brown himself received the Air Force Cross, one of the highest military decorations in the United States. The story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown has been documented in countless articles, books, and documentaries. The most comprehensive account came from author Adam Makos in his 2012 book A Higher Call, which became a New York Times bestseller. The Swedish heavy metal band Sabaton wrote a song called No Bullets Fly about the incident. Museums and educational institutions use the story to teach about ethics in warfare and the possibility of maintaining humanity even in combat. The 10-man crew of Ye Old Pub included men from across America. The tail gunner Hugh Eckenrode was killed in the mission, dying at age 23. But 8 men survived. Spencer Luke, the co-pilot, lived until 1985. Al Sadok, the navigator, until 2010. Robert Andrews, the bombardier, until 1996. Bertrand Coulombe, the flight engineer and top turret gunner, until 2006. Richard Peshout, the radio operator, until 2013. Lloyd Jennings, the waist gunner and last surviving crew member, until 2016. Sam Blackford, the ball turret gunner, lived into old age. Alex Yelisanko survived until 1980. These 8 men lived full lives after the war. They married, had children, pursued careers. Their children had children. Their grandchildren had children. By conservative estimates, Franz Stigler's decision to spare Ye Old Pub resulted in more than 300 descendants who exist today because one German pilot chose mercy over military duty. The bomber itself was so damaged that it never flew in combat again. Ye Old Pub was returned to the United States in April 1944 and eventually sold for scrap in August 1945. In 2019, a surviving B-17 operated by the Ericsson Aircraft Collection was repainted in the colours of Ye Old Pub. The restored aircraft flies in air shows, allowing modern audiences to see what a flying fortress looked like and to remember the story of mercy it represents. Franz Stigler's decision came at enormous personal cost. He gave up advancement toward the Knight's Cross, one of the highest honours Germany could bestow. He risked court-martial and execution. He violated direct military orders, yet he never regretted his choice. When asked years later why he did it, Stigler's answer was simple. He remembered his commander's words about honour. He saw wounded men trying to save their comrades. He recognized that they posed no threat, and he made the only choice his conscience would allow. Charlie Brown's courage was equally remarkable. He could have surrendered when his aircraft was crippled. His crew had given him permission to give up, but he refused. He flew a bomber that should have been unflyable across 250 miles of ocean. He saved his crew through sheer determination and skill. Gustav Rodel's words to his pilots in the Poties, North Africa, about never shooting a man in a parachute, represented a philosophy that seemed hopelessly outdated in the industrial slaughter of World War II. Yet those words, remembered in a crucial moment, saved 10 men and changed 2 lives forever. The classified nature of the incident for so many years demonstrates how uncomfortable such stories make military establishments. Wars require clear distinctions between us and them. Good and evil. Friend and enemy. Stories of enemy mercy complicate those distinctions. They make soldiers question whether the person in their gun sights is really so different from themselves. The reunion of Brown and Stigler in 1990 provided both men with healing they desperately needed. For Brown, it ended decades of wondering and nightmares. For Stigler, it validated a choice he had made at enormous risk and that he had carried in silence for nearly 50 years. Their friendship in the final years of their lives showed what could be possible when warriors meet as human beings rather than as symbols. They travelled together, spoke together, and became as close as actual brothers. When one died, the other followed soon after, as if neither could bear to be separated again. The friendship lasted 18 years. In 2008, both men's health began to fail. On March 22, 2008, Franz Stigler died in Vancouver at age 92. 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown died in Miami at age 86. They were buried thousands of miles apart, but their families knew that in the most important way, they would always be together. In a book Stigler had given to Brown years earlier, Franz had written an inscription that captured everything about their relationship. In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter, Stigler had written. On December 20th, 1943, I was able to save a B-17 from its destruction, a pilot named Charlie Brown. He is for me as precious as my brother was. Thanks, Charlie, your brother, Franz. On that frozen December day in 1943, 27,000 feet above Germany, 2 men met as enemies. They parted as something more. And 47 years later, they found each other again as brothers.